The scream of wind through broken shutters woke Samuel Pierce at dawn, but it was the second sound that made him reach for his rifle, a woman's voice, soft and trembling, coming from inside the abandoned schoolhouse. He had ridden into Muskogee, Oklahoma territory just 3 days prior with nothing but his horse, his bedroll, and enough money to start over. The year was 1889, and the land run had brought thousands of hopeful souls to this rough territory, all dreaming of claiming their piece of earth. Samuel had staked his claim on 160 acres of prairie land 2 miles outside town, but until he could build proper shelter, he had been sleeping in the old livery stable, paying the owner 2 bits a night for the privilege. The schoolhouse had stood empty for months after the previous teacher had departed for California, leaving behind only dusty desks and a chalkboard covered in the ghost of multiplication tables. Samuel had passed it every morning on his way to work his land, never imagining anyone would seek shelter there. But as he approached the weathered building with dawn breaking pink and gold across the Oklahoma sky, he heard it again, a woman's voice, speaking softly as if to comfort herself. He knocked on the door frame, the actual door having long since fallen from its hinges. "Hello? Someone in there?" The voice stopped immediately. Samuel waited, his hand resting on the doorframe but not entering. His mama had raised him right, even if she had been gone these past 5 years. "I do not mean any harm, madam," he called out. "Just want to make sure everything is all right." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the morning birds beginning their songs. Then, slowly, he heard footsteps approaching. A young woman appeared in the doorway, her dark hair disheveled and her green eyes red-rimmed from either crying or lack of sleep. She wore a simple brown traveling dress that had seen better days, and she clutched a small carpet bag to her chest like a shield. "I am sorry," she said, her voice steadier than he expected. "I know I should not be here. I will leave." "Hold on now," Samuel said, stepping back to give her space. "I am not the law and I am not here to run you off. Just concerned is all. You all right?" The woman studied him with those remarkable green eyes, and Samuel found himself straightening unconsciously under her gaze. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, around his own age of 25, and despite her disheveled state, there was a dignity to the way she held herself. "I am well enough," she said finally. "Just passing through. I will be on my way." "Passing through to where?" Samuel asked gently. "Nearest town going west is a 2-day ride, and east is not much closer." Her composure cracked slightly, and she looked away. "I have not quite decided yet." Samuel made a decision in that moment that would change the entire course of his life. "My name is Samuel Pierce. I just claimed land a couple miles from here. Got no house yet, but I do have supplies. When is the last time you ate?" "I could not possibly." "Was not really a question, madam." "You look about ready to fall over, and my mama would reach down from heaven and box my ears if I left a lady in distress." He smiled, hoping to ease her obvious anxiety. "At least let me offer you breakfast. Then if you want to move on, I will not stop you." She hesitated, and he could see the war playing out behind her eyes, pride versus hunger, caution versus need. Finally, she nodded once, a quick, decisive movement. "My name is Julia Hayes," she said. "And yes, I would appreciate something to eat." Samuel led her to the small restaurant that had opened just last month, run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who made biscuits that could make a grown man weep. Julia walked beside him through the dusty streets of Muskogee, which were already beginning to bustle with activity despite the early hour. He noticed how she kept her head high even though her dress was wrinkled and travel-stained, how she nodded politely to the few people who stared at them. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow when they entered, but said nothing except to take their order. Samuel asked for eggs, biscuits, bacon, and coffee for two, and when the food arrived, he pretended not to notice how Julia ate with careful, measured bites despite her obvious hunger. "So," he said after she had eaten enough to take the edge off, "you want to tell me how you ended up sleeping in a schoolhouse?" Julia set down her fork and met his eyes directly. "I came here with my uncle. He promised me a position as a teacher in a school he said he was establishing. When we arrived 3 days ago, I discovered there was no school, no position, and no intention of any such thing. He had debts, you see, and had arranged to settle them by marrying me off to a man named Cyrus Thornton." Samuel felt his jaw tighten. "Let me guess, this Thornton fellow is about 50 years old and already buried 2 wives. 53, actually, and 3 wives." Julia's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her coffee cup. "I refused, of course. My uncle became angry. He said I was ungrateful, that he had fed and housed me since my parents died 2 years ago, that I owed him. When I still refused, he told Thornton I was being difficult but that the arrangement would proceed regardless. So I took what I could carry and left. Where is your uncle now?" "He and Thornton were staying at the hotel. I assume they are still there, unless they have moved on." She looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to hold both vulnerability and steel. "I have no money, no prospects, and no way to leave town. I realize my situation is desperate, which is why I cannot accept any more of your charity, Mr. Pierce. You have been kind, but I will not become indebted to anyone else." Samuel sat back in his chair, thinking. Outside, a wagon rolled past, its wheels creaking. Someone shouted about fresh milk for sale. The ordinary sounds of a town waking up while this young woman's life hung in uncertain balance. "I have a proposition," he said finally. "And before you get all alarmed, hear me out. I have got land but no house. I know how to work cattle and break horses, but I cannot cook worth a damn, and I have got no head for the domestic side of homesteading. What I need is a partner, someone to help build something real out here. Mr. Pierce, let me finish. You need a place to stay and a way to earn your keep. The schoolhouse, I know it is falling apart, but the structure is sound. With some work, it could be made livable. What if we fixed it up together? You could stay there, safe and proper, and in exchange, you could help me with my homestead. Cooking, maybe help with planting a garden, mending, whatever you are willing to do. It would be a business arrangement, all respectable. And when the town gets around to hiring a real teacher, that schoolhouse would be yours to teach in." Julia stared at him as if he had sprouted a second head. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious. Look, I know we just met. I know you have no reason to trust me. But here is the truth: I could use the help and you need a place to be. This way, you are not beholden to me and I am not taking advantage of you. We would be helping each other. People would talk. A single woman and a single man, living in separate buildings 2 miles apart." Samuel shook his head. "Mrs. Patterson here could serve as a chaperone of sorts, check in on you regular like. And once you are established as the schoolhouse keeper, working toward being the teacher, people will respect that. This is a new territory, Miss Hayes. People are too busy building their own lives to worry too much about unconventional arrangements." Julia was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Samuel waited, letting her think it through. He knew it was a wild proposition, something he never would have suggested back home in Missouri. But this was Oklahoma territory, where the rules were still being written, where people reinvented themselves every day. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "You do not know me. I could be lying about everything. Are you?" "No, but you have no way of knowing that." Samuel smiled. "I have always been a pretty good judge of character. And besides, Seems to me we could both use a friend out here." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Samuel felt something shift in the air between them. It was not attraction exactly, or at least not just attraction, it was recognition. Two people who had come to this raw territory looking for a fresh start, finding each other at exactly the right moment. "All right," Julia said, "but with conditions. This is a business arrangement, as you said. I will work for my keep, but I maintain my independence, and if either of us wants to end the arrangement, we can do so with 2 weeks' notice." "Agreed." Samuel extended his hand across the table. "Agreed." Her hand was small in his, but her grip was firm. As they shook on it, Samuel found himself thinking that this was either the smartest or the most foolish thing he had ever done. Only time would tell which. They spent the rest of that day assessing the schoolhouse. It was a simple structure, about 20 feet by 30 feet, with a small storage room in the back that could be converted into sleeping quarters. The roof leaked in 2 places. Several window panes were broken, and the floor needed a good scrubbing, but the bones of the building were solid. "It is going to take some work," Samuel said, standing in the middle of the main room with his hands on his hips. "I am not afraid of work," Julia replied. She had tied her hair back with a ribbon and rolled up her sleeves, and Samuel noticed for the first time the calluses on her hands. This was not a woman who had lived a pampered life. They made a list of what was needed: glass for the windows, shingles for the roof, a proper door, a stove for heating and cooking, a bed, a table, chairs, and various cleaning supplies. Samuel had enough money saved to cover most of it, and what he could not buy, he could make. "I will pay you back," Julia said firmly when he showed her the list. "Once I find a way to earn money, you will be earning it by helping on the homestead. That is the arrangement, remember." She pressed her lips together, but nodded. Samuel recognized that stubborn set of her jaw. It was the same one he saw in the mirror when he was determined about something. They went to the general store, where Samuel purchased what they needed. The proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Calloway, looked between them with obvious curiosity, but was smart enough not to ask questions. As Samuel loaded supplies into a borrowed wagon, he noticed Julia examining a bolt of cheerful yellow fabric. "You like that?" he asked. She pulled her hand back quickly. "It is pretty, but impractical. I was just looking." Samuel caught Mr. Calloway's eye. "Add 5 yards of that yellow fabric to my order, and whatever thread and notions Miss Hayes here says she needs to make curtains." "Mr. Pierce, I cannot, business expense. That schoolhouse needs curtains if you are going to live there. Might as well be ones you like looking at." The gratitude in her eyes made him look away, suddenly feeling awkward. He was not used to the way a simple kindness could affect someone, how much it revealed about what they had been through. Over the next week, they worked on the schoolhouse from sunup to sundown. Samuel repaired the roof while Julia cleaned years of dirt and dust from every surface. He fixed the broken windows while she scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees. He built a bed frame and a table while she sewed curtains, and made a mattress from a cloth sack stuffed with fresh straw Mr. Patterson had provided. They talked while they worked, tentative at first, then with increasing ease. Julia told him about her life before Oklahoma growing up in Ohio, her father who had been a clerk, her mother who had taught her to read before she started school. She spoke of their deaths from influenza, the way her uncle had seemed kind at first before gradually revealing his true nature, how he had seen her as nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Samuel told her about his own family, his parents' farm in Missouri, how he had always been the restless one, dreaming of open spaces and possibilities. He spoke of his father's death in a farming accident when Samuel was 20, how he had stayed to help his mother until she passed peacefully in her sleep 3 years later. With nothing tying him to Missouri, He had headed west to make his own way. "You ever regret leaving?" Julia asked one afternoon. She was standing on a chair, hanging the yellow curtains she had finished the night before. "Sometimes I miss knowing every face I see, knowing the stories of every building and tree, but I do not regret seeking something of my own." He held the chair steady as she reached for the second hook. "What about you? Do you wish you had stayed in Ohio?" "There was nothing to stay for. My uncle was my only living relative, and now—" she paused, looking down at him from her perch on the chair. "Now I suppose I have no family at all." "That is not true," Samuel said quietly. "You have got friends here. Mrs. Patterson has been asking after you every day, and you have got me, for what that is worth." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "That is worth quite a lot, actually." Something warm spread through Samuel's chest, and he realized with a start that he was becoming attached to this woman. It was not just her beauty, though she was lovely even with smudges of dirt on her face and her hair coming loose from its pins. It was her strength, her determination, the way she faced each challenge without complaint. It was the comfortable silence that fell between them when they worked, and the easy conversation that flowed when they talked. He was falling for her, he realized. Falling hard and fast like a stone down a well. The thought should have scared him. They had known each other barely a week. But standing there in the schoolhouse that was slowly becoming a home, watching her arrange her cheerful yellow curtains with such care, Samuel could not bring himself to be afraid. By the end of the week, the schoolhouse was transformed. The roof no longer leaked, the windows were whole and curtained, and a proper door hung on new hinges. The small back room held a bed with a quilt Mrs. Patterson had donated, a trunk for Julia's few belongings, and even a small mirror Samuel had surprised her with. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, and a stove that filled the space with warmth. It was simple, but it was clean and safe and entirely Julia's. "I cannot believe we did all this in a week," Julia said, standing in the doorway and surveying their work. "We make a good team," Samuel replied, and he meant it in every possible way. That evening, Julia insisted on cooking dinner for them both as a thank you. She made beans and cornbread and fried salt pork. Simple fare, but the best meal Samuel had eaten in months, maybe because of the company. They ate at the table as the sun set outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I start work on the house tomorrow," Samuel said. "If you are still willing to help, I could use an extra pair of hands." Of course, that was the arrangement. "Julia," he paused, not sure how to say what he wanted to say. "I want you to know that if you would rather just stay here, keep to yourself, I would understand. You do not owe me anything beyond what you have already done." She set down her fork and looked at him with those clear green eyes. "Is that what you want? For me to keep to myself?" "No," he admitted, "but what I want is not the most important thing here." "What if what you want and what I want are the same thing?" The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Samuel's heart beat faster as he asked, "And what do you want, Julia?" "I want to help you build your house. I want to plant a garden and learn how to live on the prairie. I want—" She hesitated, then continued in a softer voice. "I want to not be alone anymore." "You are not alone," Samuel said. "I promise you that." They cleaned up together, their hands brushing as they cleared the table, and each accidental touch felt like a small miracle to Samuel. When it was time for him to leave, to ride back to the livery stable for another night, he found himself reluctant to go. "Thank you," Julia said at the door, "for everything. For seeing me as a person rather than a problem to be solved or a commodity to be traded. Thank you for giving me a chance." "Thank you for taking it," Samuel replied. "I will be by at first light tomorrow. I will have coffee ready." He rode back to town in the gathering darkness, his mind full of Julia. When he finally laid down on his bedroll in the livery stable, sleep was a long time coming. All he could think about was green eyes and yellow curtains and the way she smiled when she was genuinely happy. The next morning, true to her word, Julia had coffee ready when Samuel arrived. They rode out to his land together, Julia sitting astride Samuel's spare horse with the ease of someone who had ridden before. The land Samuel had claimed was beautiful in the way the prairie could be rolling grassland stretching as far as the eye could see, broken by occasional stands of trees, and a creek that ran clear and cold. "It is perfect," Julia said, dismounting and walking to the spot where Samuel planned to build. "You can see for miles in every direction." "That is good for spotting trouble coming," Samuel said practically, "but also means trouble can spot you. That is why we will build the house here, near the trees. Some protection from wind and weather." They spent that day and the next marking out the dimensions of the house, digging the foundation trench, and hauling rocks from the creek to create a solid base. It was back-breaking work, but Julia never complained. She dug and hauled alongside Samuel, pausing only to wipe sweat from her brow or take a drink from the canteen. "You ever built a house before?" she asked on the third day as they began setting the foundation stones. "Helped my father repair our barn a few times, built a chicken coop once, but a whole house. This will be a first." Julia laughed, and the sound carried across the prairie like music. "Well, that is comforting." "I have got a book," Samuel said defensively, though he was grinning. "Bought it from Mr. Calloway. Has diagrams and everything. A book. Even better." But despite the joking, they worked well together. Samuel's strength combined with Julia's careful attention to detail meant the foundation took shape quickly. In the evenings, they would return to the schoolhouse, where Julia would cook dinner while Samuel read from the house-building book, planning the next day's work. It was on one of those evenings, about 2 weeks after they had first met, that someone knocked on the schoolhouse door. Samuel was on his feet instantly, moving protectively toward Julia without thinking. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with a portly, well-dressed man who reeked of hair oil and self-importance. "I am looking for Julia Hayes," the man said, his eyes moving past Samuel to where Julia stood, her face gone pale. "There you are, my dear. Your uncle has been worried sick." "I am not going anywhere with you, Mr. Thornton," Julia said, her voice steady despite her pallor. "Now, do not be difficult. Your uncle explained that you have had some girlish misgivings, but this arrangement has been settled. You are to be my wife, and that is the end of it." "The lady said no," Samuel said, stepping more fully into the doorway. "I think you should leave." Thornton finally looked at Samuel properly, his lip curling in disdain. "And who are you, boy? Her protector? I know your type think you can play the hero and win the girl, but Miss Hayes belongs to me by prior agreement. Her uncle accepted payment." "I do not belong to anyone," Julia said, moving to stand beside Samuel. "And my uncle had no right to sell me like livestock. Please leave, Mr. Thornton." "I will not leave without you. I have invested money in this arrangement, and I expect a return." Thornton's voice had turned ugly, all pretense of civility dropping away. Samuel felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "You have 2 choices. You can leave now under your own power, or I can help you leave. But either way, you are leaving." For a moment, Thornton looked like he might try something foolish. Then he seemed to think better of it, perhaps recognizing something in Samuel's stance that suggested pushing further would be unwise. "This is not over," Thornton said. "I have a legal agreement with her uncle. I will be back with the sheriff." "You do that," Samuel said. "I am sure the sheriff will be real interested to hear about a man trying to force a woman into marriage against her will." Thornton stormed off into the darkness, and Samuel closed the door. When he turned, Julia was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself. "He will come back," she said. "He and my uncle, they will not give up that easily. Let them come. You are not alone in this, Julia." Samuel wanted to pull her into his arms but kept his hands at his sides. "We will go to the sheriff first thing tomorrow. Make sure he knows the situation." Thornton was bluffing about having the law on his side. No sheriff in Oklahoma Territory is going to force a woman into marriage. You do not know that. "I know that I will not let anyone take you somewhere you do not want to go." Julia looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" "Because I am falling in love with you," Samuel thought. "Because the idea of you with that man makes me want to punch something. Because in 2 weeks you have become the most important person in my life." But what he said was, "Because it is the right thing to do. Because you deserve better. Because you are my friend." She nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. "Will you stay tonight? Not in here, but nearby. I am afraid they might come back. I will sleep just outside the door. Nobody will get past me, I promise." Samuel made good on his word, bedding down on the schoolhouse porch with his rifle across his lap. It was uncomfortable, and he dozed only fitfully, but true to his word. No one approached during the night. In the morning, they rode into Muskogee together and found Sheriff Tom Crawford in his office. Crawford was a lean, weathered man in his 40s who had served as a lawman in Kansas before coming to Oklahoma Territory. He listened to Julia's story with a serious expression, his eyes narrowing when she described Thornton's visit. "Your uncle accepted money for you?" Crawford asked, his disgust evident. "I do not know if money actually changed hands, but that was the arrangement he described to me." Crawford shook his head. "That is not how things work here. I do not care what agreement your uncle claims to have made. You are a grown woman, and you have the right to refuse marriage to anyone for any reason. If Thornton or your uncle bothers you again, you come straight to me. Understood?" The relief on Julia's face was palpable. "Thank you, Sheriff. I was afraid. You have nothing to be afraid of. Oklahoma Territory is a place for fresh starts, not old world thinking about women being property." He looked at Samuel. "You keeping an eye on her?" "Yes, sir. She is staying at the schoolhouse, working as my partner on my homestead." If Crawford found the arrangement unusual, he did not show it. "Good. If you see Thornton or Miss Hayes's uncle, you send them to me." They left the sheriff's office feeling considerably lighter. As they walked through town, Julia actually smiled, the tension that had gripped her since Thornton's visit finally easing. "I cannot believe he was so understanding," she said. "Told you this was a different kind of place." They stopped at the general store to pick up supplies, and this time when Julia looked at something, a packet of vegetable seeds, Samuel did not hesitate to add it to his purchases. "For your garden," he said when she started to protest. "Every homestead needs a good garden." "Our homestead," she corrected softly. "If we are partners, it belongs to both of us." The word "ours" sent a thrill through Samuel. "Our homestead," he agreed. They spent the next month in a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Up at dawn, coffee at the schoolhouse, then out to the land to work on the house. The walls went up slowly but surely, rough-hewn timber that Samuel cut and shaped with Julia's help. They worked through spring rains that turned the prairie into an ocean of green, and through days so clear and blue they seemed to go on forever. Julia proved herself capable beyond anything Samuel had imagined. She learned to handle an axe and a hammer, to measure and cut and fit pieces together. She worked alongside him in the garden, planting the seeds they had bought, tomatoes and beans and squash and carrots. She learned to read the weather, to spot the signs of the storms that could roll across the prairie with terrifying speed. And somewhere in those long days of work and the evenings of shared meals and quiet conversation, something shifted between them. The accidental touches became less accidental. The glances held longer. The space between them seemed to hum with unspoken feelings. It was late May when Samuel finally admitted to himself that he could not keep his feelings hidden any longer. They had just finished framing out the last wall of the house, and Julia was standing in what would be the doorway, looking out at the view of rolling prairie. "I can almost see it," she said. "The house finished, curtains in the windows, smoke coming from the chimney." "What color curtains?" Samuel asked, coming to stand beside her. "Yellow, of course." She smiled up at him. "I seem to have developed a fondness for yellow." "Julia," Samuel said, his heart pounding, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him fully, and the look in her eyes suggested she knew what was coming. "All right. These past 6 weeks working with you, getting to know you, it has been the best time of my life. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being a business arrangement for me. I know we agreed to be partners, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I cannot keep pretending that I see you as just a friend or a business associate." He took a breath, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I am in love with you, Julia. Have been for weeks now. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if you want to change our arrangement, I will understand. But I needed you to know." Julia was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to light her up from the inside. "You foolish, wonderful man," she said softly. "Did you really think I was out here every day working in the sun and wind and rain just out of obligation to a business arrangement?" Samuel felt hope flutter in his chest. "You mean?" "I mean that I fell in love with you sometime around the second day, when you bought me yellow fabric without making me feel like charity. Or maybe it was the third day, when you built me a bed frame and pretended it was no big thing. Or the fourth day, when you listened to my stories like they mattered." She reached up to touch his face, her calloused hand gentle against his cheek. "I love you, Samuel Pierce. I think I have loved you since the moment you offered me breakfast and treated me like a person worth saving." Samuel felt like his heart might burst. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought you would never ask." He pulled her close and kissed her there in the doorway of their unfinished house, with the prairie wind blowing around them and the sun warm on their faces. She tasted like happiness and hope and home, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "So what do we do now?" Julia asked, her arm still around his neck. "Well, I suppose the proper thing would be to court you, take you to church socials and such. We have been working side by side from dawn to dusk for 6 weeks. I think we are past the courting stage." Samuel laughed. "Fair point. Then I guess the next proper thing would be to ask you to marry me." Julia pulled back slightly, her expression turning serious. "Samuel, are you sure? We have not known each other very long, and I come with no dowry, no family, nothing to recommend me. You come with yourself, and that is everything I want." He cupped her face in his hands. "Julia Hayes, will you marry me? Will you help me finish this house and make it a home? Will you be my partner in all things, not just business but life?" "Yes," she said, and then louder, "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her again, longer and deeper this time, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathless and laughing. "When?" Julia asked. "As soon as possible." "Tomorrow, if the preacher is available." "That's soon. I have waited my whole life to find you. I do not want to wait another day longer than necessary to make you my wife." Julia's eyes shone with tears, but she was smiling. "Tomorrow, then, or as soon as the preacher can manage." As it turned out, the preacher could manage Sunday, 3 days hence. Samuel spent those 3 days in a blur of preparation. He bought Julia a simple gold wedding band from the jeweler in town, spending almost the last of his savings on it. Mrs. Patterson insisted on making Julia a proper wedding dress, a simple but elegant affair in cream-colored cotton. Sheriff Crawford agreed to stand as a witness, along with Mrs. Patterson and her husband. The morning of the wedding, Samuel stood in the schoolhouse that had become their first home and tried to calm his nerves. He wore his best shirt and pants and had spent an hour the night before shining his boots until they gleamed. "You are making the right choice," Crawford said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Miss Hayes is a fine woman. You are lucky to have found each other." "I know it," Samuel replied. Then Julia appeared in the doorway and every thought fled from Samuel's head. The cream dress brought out the roses in her cheeks and made her green eyes look impossibly bright. Someone, probably Mrs. Patterson, had woven wildflowers into her dark hair. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They stood together in the schoolhouse that had brought them together, with the yellow curtains fluttering in the breeze and the Oklahoma sun streaming through the windows. Preacher Matthews, a kind-faced man with gray hair, spoke about love and partnership and the covenant of marriage. Samuel barely heard the words. All he could see was Julia, smiling at him like he was everything she had ever wanted. "Do you, Samuel Pierce, take Julia Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Samuel said, his voice strong and sure. "And do you, Julia Hayes, take Samuel Pierce to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Julia said, her eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "Then, by the power vested in me by the Oklahoma Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride." Samuel did not need to be told twice. He pulled Julia into his arms and kissed her as their small gathering of friends applauded. When they broke apart, Julia was crying happy tears, and Samuel felt his own eyes stinging. "Mrs. Pierce," he said softly, testing out the name. "Mr. Pierce," she replied, smiling through her tears. "My husband." They celebrated with a simple meal at Mrs. Patterson's restaurant, the older woman having closed the establishment for the afternoon to host the wedding party. There was roast chicken and potatoes and pie, and everyone toasted the happy couple with coffee, since Muskogee was in dry territory. As the sun began to set, Samuel and Julia rode back to the schoolhouse together, Julia riding in front of Samuel on his horse, leaning back against his chest. The prairie was painted in shades of gold and orange, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its evening song. "Happy?" Samuel asked, his arms around his wife. "Happier than I knew was possible," Julia replied. "This morning I woke up alone, and tonight I have a husband and a home and a future. It feels like a dream. If it is a dream, I never want to wake up." That night, in the schoolhouse that had become their first true home, Samuel and Julia began their married life together. And if the building was simple and the accommodations modest, neither of them noticed or cared. They had each other, and that was more than enough. The next months passed in a blur of hard work and deep happiness. With Julia's help, Samuel finished the house by late summer. It was not fancy, 2 rooms downstairs with a main living area and a separate bedroom, plus a loft that could be used for storage or future bedrooms. But it was solid and well built, with a good roof and real glass windows and a stone fireplace that Samuel had spent weeks perfecting. On the day they moved in, Julia stood in the main room and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "I cannot believe we built this," she said. "When you showed me those diagrams in that book, I had my doubts. But we actually did it." "We make a good team," Samuel said, echoing his words from months before. But now they meant so much more. Julia had turned the area around the house into a proper homestead. Her garden flourished, providing them with fresh vegetables through the summer and plenty to preserve for winter. She had also started raising chickens, a half-dozen hens that provided eggs and occasionally ended up in the stew pot. Samuel had built her a proper chicken coop, and she had painted it yellow, which made him smile every time he saw it. The house itself was a reflection of Julia's touch everywhere. Yellow curtains hung in every window, of course. She had sewed quilts for the bed and cushions for the chairs Samuel had built. She had arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table and hung dried herbs from the rafters. She had turned the house into a home. Samuel, for his part, had been working hard to make the homestead profitable. He had bought a small herd of cattle, just 10 head to start, and was planning to expand once he had more capital. He had also started breaking horses for other homesteaders, earning extra money with his skill at gentling even the most spirited animals. The work was hard and occasionally dangerous, but he loved it. But even more than the work and the homestead, he loved coming home each evening to Julia, loved the way her face lit up when she saw him, loved the meals they shared and the conversations that flowed easily between them, loved falling asleep with her in his arms and waking up to find her beside him. It was in late August that Julia came to him with news. They were sitting on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the prairie, when she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "There is going to be 3 of us by spring," she said softly. Samuel stared at her, his mind taking a moment to process her words. "You mean I am pregnant? We are going to have a baby?" Joy exploded through Samuel like fireworks. "A baby! We are going to have a baby!" Julia nodded, tears streaming down her smiling face. "I know it is soon, we have only been married a few months, but—" Samuel pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "It is perfect. You are perfect. I do not even have words for how happy I am right now." They held each other as the stars began to appear overhead, talking about the future, about whether it would be a boy or a girl, about names and cribs and all the things a baby would need, about how their lives were about to change in the most wonderful way. "I was so scared when I came here," Julia said eventually. "I had nothing and no one, and now I have everything I could ever want. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Samuel replied. "The day I found you in that schoolhouse was the luckiest day of my life." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Julia continued to work around the homestead, though Samuel insisted she take things easier and not overdo it. Mrs. Patterson came by regularly to check on her, and the 2 women had become close friends. But it was in early October that trouble found them again. Samuel was working with a particularly stubborn horse in the corral when he saw a rider approaching. As the figure got closer, his stomach sank. It was Julia's uncle, and he was not alone. Samuel tied off the horse and walked out to meet them, making sure he stayed between the riders and the house where Julia was inside making preserves. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. Julia's uncle Samuel had learned his name was Martin Hayes, was a thin, weaselly-looking man with a permanent sneer. The man beside him was younger, maybe 30, with the look of someone who hired out his gun. "I am here to collect my niece," Martin said. "She ran off without permission, and I mean to take her back to fulfill her obligations. Your niece is my wife now, legally married. She has no obligations to you or anyone else except me. That marriage is not valid. She was already promised to Cyrus Thornton, a promise you made, not her. And I have got the sheriff's word that everything we did was legal and proper, so I suggest you turn around and leave before this gets unpleasant. The gunman spoke up for the first time. That sounds like a threat. It is a statement of fact. You are not welcome here, and you are not taking my wife anywhere. We will see about that, Martin said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Whatever he had been expecting, Samuel's calm resolve was not it. The standoff might have escalated if Julia had not emerged from the house at that moment. She took in the scene and walked straight to Samuel's side, her head held high. "Uncle Martin, you are not welcome here. Julia, be reasonable. Thornton is willing to still honor the arrangement despite your running off. All you have to do is come back, and I am married. I am pregnant. I have a home and a life here. Whatever arrangement you made with Thornton is meaningless to me. Now leave, or I will ride into town and have the sheriff escort you out of the territory." Martin's face reddened. "After everything I did for you, you kept me as unpaid labor and then tried to sell me to pay your debts. You did nothing for me except make me grateful when I finally got away." Samuel had never been more proud of anyone in his life. Julia stood there, all 5 feet and 4 inches of her, facing down these men with absolute confidence. The gunman must have sensed that things were not going their way because he leaned over and said something to Martin. After a moment, Martin jerked his horse's reins and turned around. "You will regret this," he called back. "Both of you." "I doubt it," Julia replied. They watched until the 2 riders were out of sight, then Julia turned to Samuel and let out a shaky breath. "I was terrified," she admitted. "You did not show it. You were magnificent." Samuel pulled her close. "Do you think he will come back?" "I do not know. But I meant what I said. I will go to the sheriff if I have to. I am not losing everything we have built because of my uncle's greed." Samuel kissed the top of her head. "You are not going to lose anything. I promise." True to Julia's threat, they rode into Muskogee the next day and told Sheriff Crawford about the visit. The sheriff's face darkened as he listened. "I will have a word with your uncle and make it clear that he needs to move on. And if this Thornton fellow shows his face again, he will be cooling his heels in a cell. That is harassment, plain and simple." Whether it was the sheriff's intervention or simple acceptance that their cause was lost, Martin and the gunmen left Muskogee 2 days later. Thornton, they heard, had already moved on to Kansas, looking for another woman to add to his collection of deceased wives. "It is really over," Julia said when they heard the news. "We are finally free of all of it." "We were always free," Samuel said, "but I know what you mean. No more looking over our shoulders." With that threat behind them, they turned their full attention to preparing for the baby. Samuel built a cradle from smooth oak, spending hours sanding it until there was not a single rough edge. Julia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands creating impossibly small garments that made Samuel's heart swell every time he saw them. Winter came to the Oklahoma prairie, bringing with it cold winds and occasional snow. But the house Samuel and Julia had built together was snug and warm, the fireplace doing its job admirably. They spent long evenings by the fire, Samuel reading aloud from the newspapers and books he bought in town while Julia knitted or sewed. It was one of the happiest times of Samuel's life. Not because anything extraordinary was happening, but because everything was exactly as it should be. He had a wife he loved more each day, a home they had built with their own hands, a homestead that was slowly but surely becoming successful, and a baby on the way. What more could any man want? The baby came in late March of 1890, arriving in the middle of a spring thunderstorm that rattled the windows and drummed on the roof. Mrs. Patterson served as midwife, having helped birth half the babies in the territory, and Samuel paced outside the bedroom door trying not to wear a hole in the floor. "First babies take their time," Mrs. Patterson called out at one point. "No use wearing yourself out with worry." But Samuel could not help it. Every sound from the bedroom made his heart race. When he finally heard the thin, angry wail of a newborn, he thought his knees might give out from sheer relief. Mrs. Patterson opened the door with a smile. "You have got a son, Mr. Pierce, and your wife is asking for you." Samuel entered the bedroom to find Julia propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. She smiled when she saw him. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Samuel approached on shaky legs and looked down at the red, wrinkled face of his newborn son. The baby had stopped crying and was making small, snuffling sounds, his tiny fists waving in the air. "He is perfect," Samuel whispered. "You are both perfect. You want to hold him." Samuel carefully took the baby, marveling at how light he was, how fragile. The baby opened his eyes. They were blue, though Samuel knew they might change and seemed to look right at him. In that moment, Samuel fell in love all over again. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. They had discussed names over the winter but had not settled on anything definite. Now, holding his son, Samuel knew exactly what felt right. "What about Jesse?" he suggested. "Jesse Samuel Pierce." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "Jesse, I love it. Hello, Jesse. Welcome to the world." Jesse Pierce proved to be a healthy, happy baby who ate well and slept in reasonable stretches. Samuel was utterly besotted with his son, spending every free moment holding him or watching him sleep or making faces to try to coax out a smile. "You are going to spoil him," Julia said with fond exasperation as Samuel walked Jesse around the house for the third time in an hour, the baby having become fussy. "It is not spoiling, it is bonding," Samuel replied, but he was grinning. "Besides, look at him. How could anyone not want to hold him all the time?" As spring turned to summer, life on the homestead found a new rhythm. Julia cared for Jesse while also managing the garden and the chickens. Samuel worked the land and the cattle, plus continued breaking horses for extra income. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were building something solid, something lasting. Jesse grew quickly, hitting each milestone right on schedule. First smiles, then babbling, then sitting up on his own. Every new development felt like a miracle to Samuel and Julia, who documented each one with the kind of detail that would probably bore anyone who did not share their parental obsession. When Jesse was 6 months old, Samuel came home one evening to find Julia sitting on the porch with the baby on her lap, looking out at the prairie. Something in her expression made him pause. "Everything all right?" he asked, settling down beside her. "I was just thinking about a year ago. How different everything was, how desperate and alone I felt." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "And now I have all of this. I have you and Jesse in this home. I keep waiting to wake up and find it was all a dream." Samuel put his arm around her, pulling her and Jesse close. "It is not a dream. This is real. You are stuck with us forever." "Good," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "That is exactly what I want." As Jesse's first birthday approached in March of 1891, the homestead was thriving. Samuel's cattle herd had grown to 30 head, and he had plans to expand further. The garden Julia maintained provided most of their food, and what they could not grow, they could afford to buy thanks to the steady income from Samuel's horse-breaking work. They had even managed to save a little money, carefully stashed in a tin hidden under the floorboards. But more than the material success, it was the love that filled their home that made Samuel grateful every single day. The way Julia would hum while she worked, usually with Jesse strapped to her back in a sling Samuel had fashioned. The way Jesse's face would light up when he saw Samuel come home in the evenings. The way the three of them would sit together after dinner, Jesse playing with wooden toys Samuel had carved while his parents talked about their day. It was everything Samuel had dreamed of when he came west, and more than he had dared to hope for when he first knocked on that schoolhouse door and found Julia. For Jesse's first birthday, they invited the friends they had made in the area, Sheriff Crawford and his wife, Mrs. Patterson and her husband, a few neighboring homesteaders and their families. It was not a fancy party, just cake and coffee and children running wild through the prairie grass, but it was perfect. "Look at you," Mrs. Patterson said to Julia as they watched the children play. "A year ago you were a scared girl running from a bad situation, and now you are a wife and mother with your own land. You have come a long way." "I had help," Julia said, looking over at Samuel, who was letting Jesse and another toddler take turns wearing his hat. "You had someone who saw your worth, but you did the rest yourself." That night, after all the guests had left and Jesse was asleep in his cradle, Samuel and Julia stood on their porch watching the stars come out. "You ever think about the schoolhouse?" Julia asked. "All the time." "That is where our story started. We should go there sometime. Take Jesse and show him where his parents met." "I would like that." Samuel pulled her close. "Though I have to say I prefer this house. It has got a lot more good memories. We are just getting started on making memories. We have got a whole lifetime ahead of us." And they did. Years that stretched out before them full of possibility and promise. More children would come, a daughter 2 years after Jesse, then twin boys 3 years after that. The homestead would continue to grow and prosper. There would be hard times, droughts and storms and sick cattle, but they would face it all together. The schoolhouse, meanwhile, would eventually become an actual school. The town grew large enough to need a teacher, and Julia would volunteer to teach the children of Muskogee, passing on her love of learning to a new generation. She would teach in the mornings while Samuel watched their younger children, and in the afternoons she would return home to the life they had built together. But all of that was in the future. On this night, with their firstborn sleeping soundly inside the house they had built together, Samuel and Julia stood beneath the Oklahoma stars and simply held each other, grateful for every twist of fate that had led them to this moment. "I love you," Samuel said, words he still marveled at being able to say freely. "I love you too," Julia replied. "My cowboy who found me sleeping in a schoolhouse and made it our first home," Samuel added, completing the story they would tell their children and grandchildren in years to come. The story of how 2 lost souls found each other in the wild territory of Oklahoma, how they built a life from nothing, how love could bloom even in the hardest soil if it was tended with care. The wind blew across the prairie, carrying with it the smell of sage and grass and possibility. Inside the house, Jesse stirred in his sleep but did not wake. And on the porch, Samuel and Julia stayed wrapped in each other's arms as the night deepened around them, neither ready to let go of this perfect moment. The years rolled on like the prairie wind, constant and ever-changing. By 1895, the Pierce homestead had become one of the most successful in the area. Samuel's cattle herd numbered nearly 100 head, and he had hired a young man to help with the ranch work. Julia's garden had expanded to include an orchard, the young trees Samuel had planted now beginning to bear fruit. Their 4 children, Jesse, now 5 years old, 3-year-old Margaret, and the 2-year-old twins John and William, filled the house with noise and laughter, and the organized chaos that comes with young children. The original house had been expanded twice to accommodate the growing family. There were now 4 bedrooms upstairs and a proper sitting room in addition to the kitchen and dining area. It was still modest by some standards, but to Samuel and Julia, it was a palace. Julia had been teaching at the schoolhouse for 3 years now, beloved by her students and respected throughout the community. Samuel often stopped by during the school day just to watch her teach, marveling at the way she brought lessons to life for children who might otherwise have little access to education. "You know you are staring," Julia would say when she caught him, but she was always smiling. "Cannot help it. My wife is the smartest, prettiest teacher in all of Oklahoma Territory. I am the only teacher in Muskogee, so that is not saying much." Details. On a warm summer evening in 1895, with the children finally asleep after much protest and negotiation, Samuel and Julia sat together on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I was thinking about something today," Julia said, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. "What is that?" "About how 6 years ago I had nothing, less than nothing. I was sleeping in an abandoned building with no money, no prospects, no hope, and you could have just walked past. You could have decided I was not your problem, but you did not." Samuel was quiet for a moment, remembering that morning so clearly it could have been yesterday. The frightened woman in the doorway, the way she had held her carpetbag like armor. How something in his heart had recognized her even then as someone important, someone worth knowing. "I could not have walked past if I tried," he said finally. "It was like I do not know how to explain it, like I was meant to be there at that exact moment. Like everything that had happened in my life up to that point was leading me to that schoolhouse." "Do you believe in fate?" Julia asked. "I did not used to, but now." "How else do you explain two people from completely different places, with completely different lives, ending up in the same small town at the same time? You sleeping in a schoolhouse, me passing by at dawn. The odds of that it is astronomical. Maybe it was not fate. Maybe it was just luck. If it was the best luck I will ever have." Samuel turned to look at his wife properly. Even after 6 years of marriage and 4 children, she still took his breath away. There was gray in her dark hair now and lines around her eyes from years of smiling and squinting in the prairie sun, but to him, she was more beautiful than ever. "Samuel Pierce," Julia said softly, reaching up to touch his face, "you say the most romantic things sometimes. I mean every word." They kissed there on the porch swing as the stars began to appear overhead, a kiss that held 6 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. When they finally broke apart, Julia was smiling that particular smile that still made Samuel's heart race. "Come to bed, husband," she said. "Tomorrow will come early enough." And it did, as tomorrows always do. Jesse woke first, as he usually did, climbing into his parents' bed and demanding breakfast in the matter-of-fact way of 5-year-olds. Then Margaret was up, followed by the twins, and suddenly the house was full of noise and activity and the controlled chaos of a large family. But Samuel would not have traded it for anything. Not for all the quiet mornings in the world, not for all the money or land or success he could imagine. This his wife and children, the home they had built together, the life they shared, this was everything. After breakfast, Samuel headed out to work the cattle while Julia got the older children ready for school. Jesse, who was bright and curious like his mother, loved learning and practically dragged his younger sister out the door. Margaret, who had inherited her father's stubborn streak, was less enthusiastic but went along anyway. The twins, still too young for school, would spend the day with Samuel until Julia returned home. He had become adept at working with 2 toddlers underfoot, and the boys seemed to love being outside with their father, chasing chickens and playing in the dirt while he mended fences or tended cattle. That afternoon, with the boys down for a nap, Samuel took a moment to ride out to the far edge of his property. From this vantage point, he could see for miles in every direction rolling prairie, the creek that cut through his land, the distant smudge that was Muskogee, and beyond that, the endless horizon. He thought about that first piece of land he had claimed, how hopeful and uncertain he had been. He had wanted to build something lasting, something meaningful. And with Julia by his side, he had done exactly that. Not just the physical homestead, though that was certainly part of it, but a life, a family, a legacy. "Thank you," he said quietly, to the wind, to God, to fate or luck or whatever force had brought him to that schoolhouse on that particular morning. "Thank you for her, for all of this." The wind answered with a whisper through the grass, and overhead a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents. Samuel watched it for a moment, then turned his horse back toward home. Back to his napping twins, back to the house he had built, back to wait for his wife and older children to return from school. Back to the life that had started with a frightened woman sleeping in an abandoned schoolhouse and a cowboy who could not walk past someone in need. That evening, as had become their tradition on summer nights, the whole family gathered outside after dinner. Samuel built a small fire in the fire pit he had constructed, and they roasted apples from their own orchard on sticks. The children, sticky with apple juice and sugar, chased fireflies through the gathering darkness while Samuel and Julia watched from the porch. "Papa," Jesse called out, "tell us the story again, about how you and Mama met." It had become his favorite story, one he never tired of hearing. Samuel looked at Julia, who smiled and nodded. "All right then, come sit down and I will tell it." The children gathered around, even the twins, who were too young to fully understand but loved story time regardless. Margaret climbed into Julia's lap while Jesse sat at Samuel's feet. The twins flanked them on either side. "It was 6 years ago, in the spring of 1889, Samuel began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "I had just come to Oklahoma Territory, looking for land to claim and a new life to build. I was staying in town, sleeping in the livery stable, and every morning I would ride out to work on the land I had claimed. And one morning you found Mama," Jesse interjected, unable to contain himself. "That is right. One morning, very early when the sun was just coming up, I was passing by the old schoolhouse. The same schoolhouse where I go to school now," Margaret added. "The very same. And I heard something that made me stop. I heard your Mama's voice coming from inside the schoolhouse." Now, that schoolhouse had been empty for months, so I was surprised to hear anyone in there. I knocked on the door and called out, and that is when I first saw your Mama." Samuel looked at Julia, and even after all these years, he felt that same flutter in his chest as when he had first seen her. "What happened next?" the twins asked in unison, though they had heard this story dozens of times. "Well, your Mama was a bit scared at first because she did not know me, but I offered to buy her breakfast and she was hungry, so she agreed. We went to Mrs. Patterson's restaurant, you know Mrs. Patterson, she gives you cookies sometimes, and we talked. And you fell in love," Jesse declared. "Eventually, yes. But first we became partners. Your Mama needed a place to stay and I needed help with the homestead. So we fixed up that old schoolhouse together, made it safe and comfortable. And then we started building this house, right where we are sitting now." "Tell the part about when you asked Mama to marry you," Margaret demanded. "We were standing right about where the barn is now," Samuel continued. "The house was not finished yet, just the frame was up. And I realized that I could not imagine spending another day without your Mama as my wife. So I asked her to marry me, right there in the doorway of our unfinished house. And I said yes," Julia added, smiling at the memory. "We got married in the schoolhouse, the place where we first met. Where your Papa first found me and decided to help me even though he did not know me at all. Because Papa is a hero," Jesse said proudly. Samuel laughed. "I am not a hero, son. I am just a man who was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time." "And I am lucky enough that he did not just walk past," Julia said softly, her eyes meeting Samuel's over the children's heads. "Tell about when I was born," Jessie demanded. "And the storm." So Samuel continued the story, telling about the thunderstorm and Mrs. Patterson delivering Jessie, about holding his son for the first time and feeling like his heart might burst from happiness. Then he told about Margaret's birth and the twins, each story embellished slightly to make the children laugh. By the time he finished, the fire had burned down to coals and the children were drooping with sleep. Samuel carried the twins while Julia ushered Jessie and Margaret inside. Together, they got all 4 children into bed, a nightly ritual that sometimes felt like herding cats, but that Samuel cherished nonetheless. Later, alone again on the porch, Samuel and Julia sat in comfortable silence. This was Samuel's favorite time of day, when the work was done and the children were asleep, and it was just the 2 of them under the stars. "You ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Julia asked. "If you had not found me that morning? If I had left town before we met?" "Sometimes," Samuel admitted. "But then I realize it does not matter because it did not happen that way. We found each other. Everything else is just speculation. I think I would have been lost forever. You saved my life, Samuel. Not just from the immediate situation with my uncle and Thornton, but in every way that matters. You gave me back my hope. You saved mine too. I came out here thinking I just needed land and work. I did not realize how lonely I was until I met you. How much I needed someone to share all of this with." Julia leaned against him, and Samuel wrapped his arm around her. Above them, the stars wheeled across the vast Oklahoma sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their wedding, the births of their children, and every moment in between. "I love you," Julia said, simple words that still carried the weight of everything they meant to each other. "I love you too, today, tomorrow, and every day after that until my last breath." They sat there until the fire had gone completely cold, and the night air had taken on the chill that came even in summer. Then, hand in hand, they went inside to their home, the home they had built together from nothing but determination and love. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of growing children and growing prosperity. By 1900, when the new century dawned, Jesse was 10 years old and already helping his father with the ranch work. Margaret, at 8, was proving to be as good a teacher as her mother, often helping the younger students at the schoolhouse. The twins, now 7, were identical in appearance but completely opposite in temperament. John was quiet and thoughtful while William was loud and adventurous. Julia had taken a break from teaching after the birth of their 5th child, a daughter they named Sarah, born in the winter of 1898. Now, with Sarah toddling around the house and occasionally escaping to explore the yard, Julia was considering returning to the schoolhouse, at least part-time. "Mrs. Henderson wants to retire," Julia told Samuel one evening. Mrs. Henderson had been helping teach the older students while Julia was home with Sarah. "The school board asked if I would come back full-time this fall." "What do you want to do?" Samuel asked. "I love teaching. I miss it. But I also love being home with Sarah, watching her grow." "What if you did both? Teach in the mornings, come home for lunch in the afternoon?" Julia's face brightened. "Do you think that would work?" "I think we could make it work. We always do." So that fall, Julia returned to teaching part-time, bringing Sarah with her to the schoolhouse. Sarah would play quietly with her toys or nap in the back room while Julia taught her students. It was an unconventional arrangement, but it worked for them, just like everything else in their unconventional life. Samuel, meanwhile, had become a respected figure in the growing community of Muskogee. His opinion was sought on matters ranging from cattle breeding to land disputes. He had even been asked to serve on the town council, though he had declined, preferring to focus on his family and his ranch. "You are becoming an important man," Julia teased him one evening after he had mediated a disagreement between two neighboring ranchers. "I am just a cowboy who got lucky," Samuel replied, pulling her into his arms. "You are more than that. You are a husband, a father, a rancher, a friend, and a pillar of this community. None of it means anything without you." It was true. Every success, every achievement, every moment of happiness in Samuel's life traced back to that morning in 1889, when he had knocked on a schoolhouse door and found his future waiting inside. In the spring of 1903, 14 years after that fateful meeting, Samuel and Julia stood together in the doorway of the original schoolhouse. It had been years since Julia had taught there. The town had grown enough to need a larger school building, constructed just the year before. The old schoolhouse stood empty once again, though this time it was maintained rather than abandoned. "I cannot believe it has been 14 years, Julia said, looking around the familiar space. The yellow curtains she had made so long ago were long gone, replaced and replaced again over the years. But the room still held the memory of them, of those early days when everything was new and uncertain and full of possibility. "Feels like yesterday and forever at the same time," Samuel replied. Jesse had ridden with them, now a young man of 14 who was nearly as tall as his father. He looked around the schoolhouse with interest. "This is where you lived before you built our house?" "For a few weeks, yes," Julia said. "Your father and I fixed it up together. This is where I felt safe for the first time since my parents died. This is where your father and I became friends, then partners, then more. And this is where we got married," Samuel added. "Right here in this very room." Jesse walked around, examining the space with the keen eye of someone trying to picture history. "It is smaller than I thought." Samuel laughed. "Everything seems smaller when you look back at it, but at the time this place was our whole world." They spent an hour in the schoolhouse, sharing memories and stories. Samuel showed Jesse where he had repaired the roof, where Julia had hung her first curtains, where they had stood when Preacher Matthews had married them. Julia showed him where she had slept those first frightening nights, where she had cooked their first shared meal, where she had realized she was falling in love with the cowboy who had refused to abandon her. "You two are the most romantic people I know," Jesse said, but he was smiling. "No wonder Margaret is always reading those romantic novels Mrs. Patterson loans her." "Romance is not a bad thing," Julia said. "Someday you will meet someone who makes your heart race and your palms sweat and your thoughts scatter, and you will understand." Jesse made a face, but Samuel saw the curiosity in his son's eyes. He was at that age where girls were becoming interesting rather than annoying. Soon enough, Jesse would experience his own first love, his own romantic adventures. But for now, on this spring day in 1903, it was enough to stand in this building that held so much history, so many memories, so much love. Samuel put his arm around Julia and pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side. "Thank you," he said softly, so only she could hear. "For what?" "For saying yes. To breakfast that first morning, to the partnership, to marriage, to all of it. Thank you for building this life with me." Julia turned in his arms to face him properly. At 37, she was even more beautiful to him than she had been at 23. The years had added character to her face, wisdom to her eyes, and strength to her spirit. She was his partner in every sense of the word, his equal in all things, the love of his life. "Thank you for finding me," she replied. "For not walking past the schoolhouse that morning. For seeing me as a person worth saving, worth knowing, worth loving." They kissed there in the doorway of the schoolhouse, just as they had on their wedding day 14 years before. Jesse, thoroughly embarrassed by his parents' public display of affection, wandered outside to wait by the horses. When they finally broke apart, both smiling, Samuel took one last look around the schoolhouse. It was just a building now, empty and quiet, waiting for whatever purpose the town decided to put it to next. But it would always be special to him and Julia, the place where their story began. "Come on," Julia said, taking his hand. "Let us go home, home." Not the schoolhouse, not the unfinished frame of a dream, but the solid, sprawling house they had built together over years of love and labor. Home to their 5 children, their thriving ranch, their life together. They rode back with Jesse, who chattered about his plans for the future, his dreams of expanding the ranch or maybe becoming a horse trainer like his father. Samuel and Julia listened, offered advice when asked, and mostly just enjoyed being together as a family. When they arrived home, Margaret had dinner started. The twins were supposedly doing chores but were actually playing by the creek, and Sarah was attempting to teach the dog to shake hands. It was chaos and noise and mess, and Samuel loved every second of it. That night, after dinner was eaten and dishes were cleaned, after the children had been sent to bed with varying degrees of protest, Samuel and Julia ended up where they always did on their porch, watching the stars come out. "You think we will ever run out of things to talk about?" Julia asked. "After 14 years, I doubt it. Besides, even if we do, I am perfectly happy just sitting here with you in silence. Good, because I plan to keep you around for a very long time. How long? Forever. Maybe longer if I can manage it." Samuel laughed and pulled her close. "Forever sounds about right to me." They sat there as the prairie night settled around them, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. The schoolhouse where they met still stood in town, a quiet testimony to beginnings and hope. But this porch, this house, this family, this was their true home, built on a foundation of love that had only grown stronger with time. In the years that followed, their life continued to unfold in the normal rhythms of a large family on a working ranch. Jesse grew into a fine young man and eventually found his own wife, a spirited young woman named Emma, who reminded Samuel more than a little of Julia at that age. Margaret became a teacher like her mother, taking over the schoolhouse when Julia finally retired from teaching to focus on helping Samuel with the ranch and enjoying their growing number of grandchildren. The twins went their separate ways. John became a veterinarian, caring for animals throughout the territory, and eventually the state when Oklahoma gained statehood in 1907. William, true to his adventurous nature, became a deputy sheriff and spent his days maintaining order in the still sometimes wild Oklahoma landscape. Sarah, their youngest, stayed close to home, marrying a neighboring rancher's son and settling on land adjacent to the Pierce homestead. Samuel and Julia were able to watch their youngest daughter's children grow up practically in their backyard, a blessing they had not anticipated but treasured deeply. By 1920, 31 years after that fateful morning at the schoolhouse, Samuel and Julia were grandparents many times over. Their hair had gone gray, their faces lined with the marks of age and laughter. The ranch that Samuel had started with nothing but determination, and a land claim had become one of the most successful in the region, spanning thousands of acres and supporting not just their immediate family, but providing employment for several families in the area. But more than the material success, more than the land or the cattle or the respect they had earned in the community, Samuel and Julia were rich in love. The love they had for each other, tested and proven through 3 decades of marriage. the love of their children and grandchildren, the love of friends who had become family. On a warm spring evening in 1920, Samuel and Julia sat on their porch, the same porch where they had sat countless times before, watching the same stars in the same sky, feeling the same prairie wind that had blown on their wedding day, and the day they met, and every day in between. "Do you remember what you said to me that first morning?" Julia asked. Her voice was softer now with age, but it still had the same quality that had captivated Samuel from the beginning. "I said a lot of things that morning." "Which part?" "You said your mama would box your ears if you left a lady in distress. You made me feel like I was worth helping, worth caring about, when I felt like I was worth nothing at all." Samuel took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "You were always worth everything. I just happened to be the lucky fool who got to prove it to you." "Lucky fool," Julia repeated, smiling. "I suppose we have both been lucky fools, lucky to find each other, foolish enough to take a chance on what must have seemed like an impossible situation. Best foolish decision I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of evening crickets chirping, the distant call of an owl, the soft sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. From inside the house, they could hear the clock chiming 9 times. It was late by their standards these days, but neither of them was quite ready to go inside yet. "Samuel," Julia said softly. "Yes, love. If you had it all to do over again, knowing everything that would happen, all the struggles and the joys and the sorrows and the triumphs, would you still knock on that schoolhouse door?" Samuel did not even have to think about it. "Every single time. In every possible world, in every possible version of our lives, I would always knock on that door. I would always offer you breakfast. I would always fall in love with you. Some things are just meant to be." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, and Samuel felt the same contentment he had felt for 31 years whenever she was close. They had built a good life together, he and his Julia. A life that started with fear and uncertainty and desperation, and grew into something beautiful and lasting and real. The schoolhouse still stood in town, though it had been converted into a library now. Samuel and Julia had donated books to the collection, including the house building manual that had guided them through constructing their first home. Sometimes they would visit, walking through the building hand in hand, remembering. But mostly they were content to be here, in the home they had built, surrounded by the family they had raised, living the life they had created together from nothing but hope and determination and love. As the stars came out one by one, filling the vast Oklahoma sky with their ancient light, Samuel thought about all the paths his life might have taken, all the choices he could have made differently, all the ways things could have turned out. But in the end, there was only this path, these choices, this life. There was only Julia, who had been sleeping in a schoolhouse when he found her. There was only the decision to help, to stay, to love. There was only the home they had made, first in that schoolhouse, then in the house they built together, and finally in the hearts they shared. "Time for bed?" Julia asked, though neither of them moved. "In a minute. I just want to sit here with you a little longer. We have sat here together for 31 years. You would think we would run out of moments to savor. Never. I could sit here with you for 31 more years and still want just one more minute." Julia squeezed his hand. "Then let us have this minute, and then another, and then as many as we are blessed to have." So they sat there under the stars, the cowboy and the woman he had found sleeping in a schoolhouse all those years ago. They had started with nothing but a business arrangement, and turned it into a love story that would be told and retold by their children and grandchildren for generations to come. They had built a home, a family, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And when they finally did go inside, walking slowly hand in hand through the house they had built together, past the pictures of their children and grandchildren on the walls, past the furniture Samuel had made and the quilts Julia had sewn, past all the accumulated evidence of a life well lived, they went to bed in each other's arms. Just as they had every night for 31 years, just as they would every night for however many years remained to them. Together, always together, the way they were meant to be from that very first morning when a cowboy knocked on a schoolhouse door and found not just a woman in need, but his entire future.